You come to a Java conference and I'm telling you that I'm going to talk about knowledge management. But don't worry, this is knowledge management for the technically inclined. And that's definitely all of you. Well, I hope it is, otherwise you're probably in the wrong place. So, as we just said, I am an architect and I am the author of Communication Patterns. So I come from the UK, you might be able to tell from my accent, so I'm one of the speakers that's come a little bit of a long way. And I go into businesses and help them with their software and their enterprise architecture, and also using things like knowledge management, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So you can find me in all these places if you want to. Now, one of the key messages today is that knowledge management is vital to success for any organization. And what I want to tell you today is what actually is knowledge management. It was actually, the term was first used by McKinsey internally in 1987, which at the same time seems a very long time ago, but also not very long ago in terms of software and knowledge. And knowledge management isn't just documentation, which is what most people think of when they hear the phrase knowledge management. And it isn't just by Confluence and you're done. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry when it comes to Confluence. But one does not simply buy knowledge management. These apps can help you, but they're only a very small part of what you're doing. So I've told you what knowledge management isn't. Now we're going to look at what people think knowledge management is. And there you go. If you look up knowledge management, you will find all of these things. Excuse me. And it's very hard to tell what is applicable to your situation. There are an awful lot of models. There are a lot of companies trying to sell you their software for managing your knowledge. And it's really difficult to work out what applies to your context. And this is what puts a lot of people off when it comes to knowledge management. Now, before we go into some examples of knowledge management and a definition, I want you to have to think about just some very simple tasks that you do and whether they are actually knowledge management. So the first of those is naming a code repository. Is that knowledge management? It is, because when you name something, you enable people to discover it and be able to know what is in there without opening it up and looking through it. And of course, naming is one of those two really difficult things in software architecture, because naming things, cache invalidation, and off-by-one errors. Sorry, it's one of my favorites. I couldn't resist saying it. So how about integrating one application with another? Is that knowledge management? It is, because the edges of your architecture and your software are where you discover knowledge and where you exchange knowledge. And how about lessons learned? This is probably the easiest one. This is probably the kind of knowledge management that you do. And you note down your lessons learned so you can learn from past mistakes and build on your successes, hopefully. Now, today I want to kind of stretch your idea of knowledge management. It actually affects how you build software as well as how you run it. Now, I can't stretch quite as much as Alfie there. He's having quite a good time there. He doesn't look like it, but he has what I call resting grump face. He's happy, don't worry. So I said we're going to look at some examples. Now, this is a very non-exhaustive list. There are many, many different examples of knowledge management. But the first one is, as we British say, inventories, or I think you normally say inventories. So I'll say both, just so everyone knows what I'm talking about. And so that's kind of a catalogue of all your knowledge assets. Then there's dashboards. These can be static, they can be dynamic. There's documents. That includes all the different files you've got. There's also an expertise locator, and that's where you've got knowledge in people's heads, and you need people to be able to look up who's got that knowledge. Policies and procedures that you use are part of your knowledge management. Wikis, articles, knowledge bases, blogs. These are all part of the knowledge management as well, including forms and templates as well that you use in your organization. Databases, you're going to have a huge range of those, whether it's in the software you create, in the software you buy, and in all of your management in your business as well. And then there are meetings and workshops, and these generate and curate a lot of knowledge. Whether it's actually recorded is another thing. And the other thing to think about with knowledge management is all the information that's not recorded. And there's an awful lot in people's heads. Now, looking around, I think there's probably going to be an awful lot of information in this room that is in people's heads and not written down somewhere. So knowledge management is the process of capturing, distributing, and effectively using knowledge. That's what Tom Davenport gave us in 1994, and a more succinct definition hasn't really appeared since then. And one of the reasons that knowledge management could really start to thrive at that point was the rise of computer networks like the internet and intranets, because it meant that it was easier to distribute and effectively use that information. Now, I said this was all too complicated. So let's go to Tom Davenport's definition. We capture, distribute, and effectively use. But there's one change I want to make to this, because I don't think distribute is the right word anymore. It implies that there's a sender and a known receiver, like sending an email. And we don't necessarily know who is going to be using our knowledge. But how do we solve that problem when we're looking at software? One of those ways is pub/sub. And so I'm changing this to publish instead, so that we can start to think about this in the right way. So I'm going to change this 30 years later, because it is actually 30 years since then, doesn't seem that long, but I'm going to say knowledge management is the process of capturing, publishing, and effectively using knowledge. Of course, with a hat tip to Tom Davenport for the original. Now, I said that knowledge management shouldn't be complicated, but it is complex. Subtle difference. So think about sharing knowledge between individuals and teams and departments in your organization. But no organization is in a vacuum. You've got suppliers, you've got partners, you've got customers. You might be outsourcing things, like some of your development. And this is inter-organizational knowledge. You've got knowledge within other organizations that you probably should know about, but probably don't. And the big problem with that is that these relationships change over time, and that means that knowledge gets lost. Think about the disruption that's caused if you change your outsourcing partner. If you're outsourcing, say, development, you've got to make all these new working relationships. And if you've got things written down, if you've got that knowledge management, that softens the blow. But if you don't have things written down, you're going to be fighting against the priorities of other people who want your outgoing team to finish off all the technical stuff when you just want them to write down what they've already done. That's going to be a bit of a battle. So in reality, knowledge management is ignored, forgotten, and low priority. And that means we don't get this capture, which means we've got nothing to publish, and we can't effectively use it. You don't get any organizational learning. And if you don't get organizational learning, your organization becomes stagnant. And if your organization is stagnant, competitors can overtake you. So IDC says that Fortune 500 companies lose around $31.5 billion a year by not sharing knowledge. And that's just the Fortune 500. What about all the companies in the world? So let's have a look at some knowledge management in the wild to help with stopping ourselves from losing this money. Now, how do you think knowledge management affected teams when we went into the pandemic? Those with better knowledge management will have fared an awful lot better. And now we have companies that tend to have a mixture of people. They're in the office, they might be hybrid, or they might be completely remote. And so we need to be thinking about optimizing for this remote working. There's a lot of companies at the moment pulling people back into the office, and they're missing out on something here. Remote first can help you to enable people to do their best work wherever they are. And this isn't the so-called remote friendly, where remote work is like a perk. It's a bolt-on to office work. In remote first, you optimize for remote work. Everyone is seen as a remote worker, and it's actually encouraged. When you have a meeting, everybody joins in the same way. So if everyone happens to be in the office, you can all just join like that. But if you've got people at home, everyone joins it the same way, and this levels the playing field. You also value output over time worked. And this is really good for everyone because it discourages the sitting with your bum in your seat for 80 hours a week, just trying to get that promotion. You are judged on your output, not on how long you are seen to be sitting in the office. And there's an emphasis on communication, specifically asynchronous communication. But this means that anyone can contribute fully, whether they are, well, wherever they are, whenever they are, whatever days that they work. And because of these, we get business continuity. If you have people in different time zones, you can have work carrying on through the day. But also, if you have things like snowstorms, public transport strikes, eclipses that everyone goes out and watches in the middle of the day when they're supposed to be working, you still get the business continuity because there's people working other places, and if your office hasn't got that power, people can all work from home and everything just flows because it's normal. You get improved productivity because people are valued for their output and therefore they are happier to do this work and not just sit there and look like they're working. And then you also get better documentation, and the main reason for this is your asynchronous communication, which creates documentation due to its very nature. Now, I've mentioned asynchronous versus synchronous communication. And before I go on, I want to define those because it's important to understand the difference. So, synchronous communication relies on all parties being available at the same time and responding in real time. Asynchronous communication does not assume or expect the recipient to pick up or respond to a message as soon as it's received. So that's the important distinction. And you use these in your software as well. Now, is this talk that I'm giving synchronous or asynchronous? Yeah. So for everyone watching here live, this is synchronous. Go, give me a wave, synchronous audience. But for everyone watching this afterwards, the recording, this is asynchronous. So I'm going to give a wave to the audience watching this later on. And so you can see that whether something is synchronous or asynchronous can change over its life cycle. It's not as clear-cut as you think. And when we look at these different stages, these can all be synchronous or asynchronous. Capture can be done synchronously and together. It can also be done asynchronously over time. And I've just said that you can publish synchronously and asynchronously, and that can also change over time. And when you're effectively using that, you might be doing something at the time, or you might be applying that later. So I want to give you a few knowledge management techniques that you can use when you are at work. So, glossaries. These are a collection of a definition of terms. They're a context-specific dictionary, and you've probably used these before. So I'm going to give you a few best practices to make these even better. You want to centralize your glossary so that people can find it. You don't want people to be looking through several glossaries to find out the definition of a term, or trying to work out which glossary to put a new term in, or even which glossaries. You don't want to be duplicating things. So centralize so people can find it, but you want to federate it for maintenance. You don't want a gatekeeper or a bottleneck. Everyone should be able to maintain your glossary. You want to partition it by domain. Now, you don't need to be doing domain-driven design for this, which is a method I quite like. But this is about having different definitions for the same term in different parts of your business. So when you are creating a definition, you need to define the scope. Something in finance might mean something quite different in your software. And then you want to cross-reference for simplicity. So when you're defining a term, you will probably have a word in there that is defined somewhere else or needs to be defined somewhere else. So cross-reference, don't duplicate. Link from other places into your glossary so people can find it, and where appropriate, link to other places from your glossary as well. Now, another method you can use is products over projects. And this is a mindset change. This is, instead of organizing things by project, you organize it around your products. Now, if you do have projects, here you've just got one. Maybe if you're unlucky, it's called Project Phoenix. Put your hand up if you've ever worked on a Project Phoenix. Yeah, the rest of you are lucky. So with these projects, if you've only got one, it's easy to find these things. It's easy to know what's been created, what exists, what we need to do. But sometimes you might have more than one project working on the same product, and maybe you've got old projects which are finished. And if people don't know about them, then you don't get this shared understanding. You get silos, or maybe they're coops in this case because of all the birds. But people don't talk to each other. People recreate things. But if we organize by product, we can create both implicit and explicit links between all this information. If there are requirements in Project Phoenix, the other projects know about it and can reference it, even if they've made changes to those now. And this means we get this holistic view, we get a long-term view, we get reuse. And these all benefit the business overall. Now, inventories, or inventories, whichever you like, these are when you're cataloguing all of your data and knowledge assets. And you're going to find that there are two different types of information that you're looking at here. Explicit knowledge is the knowledge that's really kind of easy to articulate and write down, whereas the implicit knowledge is the stuff that's kind of harder to articulate, harder to write down. And when you're finding all this information, you're going to find that this explicit knowledge probably is already written down, but you're going to need to know what that knowledge is. You're going to want to know where it is so people can actually find it. You want to know who created it, who needs it and accesses it, who's responsible for maintaining it. You want to know the structure. Is it a diagram, a wiki page, a database? And you want to know the purpose, what it's for. With the implicit knowledge, this is going to be in people's heads. So the main focus here is on who. Who has that knowledge and expertise? Then, where is that person? Because that's where the knowledge is. What is that knowledge as well? But you also, with these, want to think about structure, because some implicit knowledge is what we call tacit knowledge. And this is where the knowledge is either impossible or incredibly difficult to articulate. Think about things like leadership or riding a bike. That kind of knowledge will definitely need to stay in people's heads. And that's the kind of thing you put in your expertise locator. But some of this implicit knowledge you're going to find should be made explicit. And part of this inventory should be that you work out which bits you want to make explicit and get people to write down. Now, personal knowledge management. This can help your enterprise knowledge management. And I'm not talking about personal knowledge here. I'm talking about the knowledge that you work with personally, which isn't kind of shared in your organization. And if you encourage people to manage their personal knowledge, then you get a ripple out effect when this stuff is shared into the organization, because it was already managed at that point. It's quite a good bottom-up method here. It's also a bit of a rabbit hole. So, well out of scope for today, but I encourage you to have a look at personal knowledge management, because it can help to boost your career if you're managing your knowledge well, because you're then learning better as well. Now, when we build software, we automate things. We automate testing, we automate deployment, maybe infrastructure. So we should be doing that also with our knowledge management. You may have heard of documentation as code. The overall process here is that the documentation is authored. This is normally plain text, maybe Markdown, ASCII doc, that kind of thing. You then convert it, and you convert it into whatever you need. So it might be PDF, might be into HTML, and then you publish those different versions. So I'm going to show you an example. So this is normally done with something like a Git repository, and all of these files with all of the information go in there. It doesn't just need to be Markdown. It can be things like diagrams as code, like plant UML. It can be JSON. It can be whatever your context needs. You then have this optional review for things like sense and accuracy. And that's particularly useful if this is going to be knowledge that's published publicly. Then you have an auto review, and this is for things like broken links and syntax, spelling, that kind of thing. And once all of this has been done, you can run this build process to produce and publish these different versions of your knowledge. And this is all done with not much human intervention. But the key things to remember here are that this isn't just producing a PDF version and an HTML version of the same thing. This is producing a PDF, which is a report for C-suite, a PDF that is some documentation for your partner. This is an internal wiki for how to use some APIs, or some HTML for how to use your external APIs on your website. And so you can update one document within your repository, and it will update that same information in all the different places that you've used it. We're separating our data from its presentation, which we do in software all the time. And this is what we need to do in our knowledge management to optimize it too. Now, I said docs as code. We can also talk about knowledge management as code. And this is all about automating and generating documentation. So here's one example. This is Open API. And this is the kind of thing that it changes all the time. You could not keep this updated manually. And so this allows you to explore the endpoints. It even allows you to interact with them. And you can also explore models which are used in this. And the end user of your API really needs this. But imagine trying to maintain this if you weren't doing it automatically. So this is codified knowledge management. Another example is contract testing. Now I'm going to give you an example of consumer-driven contract testing here. So your consumer service tests itself against some mocks, its interactions. And those interactions are recorded as a contract, and they are stored in a contract broker. And that shares these contracts with any producer services, which then test themselves against this contract using a mock as well. And so this is all done in isolation. Your contract broker can normally allow you to view that library as well. And I'll show you an example here. This is a product called Pact, which is open source, and it's allowing you to view all of these contracts and their statuses. And this is your dashboard. This is knowledge management. And it's so much less expensive than standing up a whole test environment and deploying all your services into it and then trying to cover that with tests. Now, what we're trying to do here is move towards what I call a hive mind. And this isn't like the Star Trek hive mind. You're not going to be controlled, don't worry. But what we're trying to do here is optimize our knowledge. We're trying to share the right knowledge so it's available at the right time. We're trying to automate that knowledge. And we can think of this in terms of cognitive load, which is how much information your working memory or your brain can process at one time. And when we don't have knowledge management, we have a high cognitive load and we've got chaos here. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of companies sit. Then when we start to introduce knowledge management, we reduce that cognitive load because people can find the information they need when they need it, at least most of the time. So they don't have to try and remember things. Then we're trying to go towards this hive mind. We're reducing that cognitive load down as far as we can. We are hiding things. This is knowledge management going really well. This is more of a continuum than having these breaks. But when we're getting to this hive mind, this is the automated. This is being able to find what you need, when you need it, all the time. And we can also look at this with the wisdom hierarchy. And you can see here that knowledge is on top of information, which is on top of data. So this is data engineering. This isn't a soft skill. You're engineers. You engineer software. You engineer data. And we can't get to this wisdom at the top. We can't get to this hive mind without that knowledge layer. We can't skip a layer. Now, I'm at a tech conference and I'm speaking, so I have to talk about AI. It's a bit like Conway's Law. So if you're playing conference bingo, that's 2 for you there. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, I'm really hoping that AI is going to come and sort out our knowledge management because it's not going very well. And I have some bad news. Unfortunately, it's not. Because when it comes to AI, we know that this is the situation. If you don't put something good in, you won't get something good out. So don't hold your breath. Now, one really good way to move towards this hive mind is by collaborating and capturing knowledge together. So I've got a few techniques that you can use here. Now, the first one here is called big picture event storming. Now, there's different levels of event storming as well, but I want to focus on this one. This is where you're going to pull together your stakeholders. You're going to get your domain experts. You're going to get your technical people as well. And you're going to break down those silos. You're going to get that implicit information out of people's heads. And you're going to map out what is happening or what should happen in your system. You're also going to be able to pinpoint the pain points and problems. And those are really critical when you're looking at knowledge management and system building, because those are the places where people disagree on what is happening or what should happen. Or maybe that there's just lots of problems that keep happening in that area. So that's event storming. There's also domain storytelling. Now this is similar. You're going to have similar stakeholders. This is really useful if you want to capture requirements. It's useful for showing what your system is at the moment, your as is. It's useful for planning your to be. And you create diagrams like this with the numbers and the icons. But the big difference between domain storytelling and event storming is that with event storming, you get lots of different options on the same version. But with domain storytelling, you're focusing in on one particular story. There's no ifs or buts in a domain story. If there's another version of it that is important, then you create more than one. That's domain storytelling. Now, a bite-sized architecture session. This, in my opinion, isn't just for architecture and code. This can be used for business or a mixture of business and technical. Now, these, again, you're going to have the people with the knowledge coming into the room. And the two things that I want to point out really with these are, first of all, number 2 up there, alone together. That is a time when, although everyone's in the same room, they're all working by themselves quietly, just for a short time, getting their ideas and thoughts down on paper. And the really good thing about this is that you then get a lot more information, a lot more perspectives, because people aren't drowned out by the loudest voice in the room. You then get a lot more engagement from people because they've been heard. The other thing is this cycle. You can get, if you can get this going in your company, you can get incremental change going. And both of these can be used with those other techniques, particularly alone together. I definitely recommend it. Now, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, he likes a crisp document and a messy meeting. And you may have heard of this 6-page memo, but it's basically a narrative document and it's created before the meeting. Then the first 30 minutes of this meeting is spent just reading the document and digesting it and making notes. And then the rest of this meeting is discussion. Now, there are some good things about this. So they've ring-fenced that time for you to read it. It means you're not trying to catch up in your evenings beforehand. It means you're not waiting on the one person who hasn't actually read it beforehand. And you're all quite literally on that same page when you're discussing it. Also, memos can be a lot easier for the audience to digest compared to a presentation. So apologies for that, but I think you prefer the presentation to a 6-page memo for today. But there are some downsides to this. If you've only got 30 minutes to think about it, I bet you're going to come up with some thoughts after that meeting. And that can move on and sort of drag into other meetings. Also, although the meeting is collaborative, that document needs to be collaborative as well. And so you need to focus on making that collaborative. Now, architecture decision records. You may have heard of these. They're not just for architects. They are for developers. They're for non-technical people to have an input on as well. And they're typically structured something like this. And they're typically also a text document, markdown, ASCII, that kind of thing. But they don't just record the decision that was made. They record the why. Why was this decision made? What's the reasoning? And why do we need the why? It helps you avoid quite a few problems. So there's changing important decisions. If you don't know why a decision was made, you don't know if it's safe to change it. You can end up changing something that was really important, wasting a lot of time and money. Maybe you can't even backpedal and change what you've done. It could be a complete disaster. There's also what Birgitta Bokler of ThoughtWorks calls whack-a-mole decisions. So these are when questions pop up all the time and need to be pushed down again. And it wastes time every time someone goes and investigates it. If you've got an ADR of that decision, it takes less than 5 minutes to answer that question and push it back down. There's also onboarding. When people join your team, they should have questions about what you've done and why you've done it. And the people on your team don't want to explain over and over and over again why decisions were made. They probably don't actually remember themselves. So ADRs need to be part of your onboarding process. Then there's the classic staff turnover. If someone leaves with the information in their heads, it's gone. But then there's memory as well. People who stay at your organisation don't necessarily remember why a decision was made, especially if that decision was 5 years ago. In fact, they probably don't remember why a decision was made last week. Your brain is not made for remembering things. It's made for having ideas and connecting things. But we can take these decision records a step further. We can use these throughout the business. And here are some examples. How about procurement? If you have a decision record about a contract that's been signed, when that contract comes up for renewal, you can easily see, have things changed? Is this decision still valid? There's also security. If you have a security decision record that says why you're recommending, say, a particular authorization service, then people within the company can see if that does apply to them. And if it doesn't, then they can have that conversation with security. There's also hiring. This can have legal implications. You shouldn't rely on your hiring manager making any notes at all, let alone having kept them and knowing where they are. Then there's also business strategy. Now, these get handed down. If people actually understand the business strategy and why they're doing it, they're much more likely to follow it. And of course, when it comes time for management or C-suite to review that strategy, it's much easier. And of course, when change happens, because change happens all the time, these decision records are there and you can review them easily. Now, one thing to think about with decision records and the 6-page memo is that you can discuss these decision records in a meeting in the same way as a 6-page memo. You can also store and catalogue your 6-page memos in the same way that you would with decision records. You can apply these different things and cross-reference them. Now, I've covered quite a lot today in not very much time. So I wanted to give you a few key takeaways for today. Now, if you have a software big ball of mud, you've probably got a documentation big ball of mud as well. They feed into each other. If you've got one, it'll feed into the other. And the same happens with a distributed big ball of mud. But I like to call these a wall of ivy instead. If you think about it, all those implicit relationships between your services, they're all kind of hidden under those leaves, the upstream and the downstream. And if you try and sort this out and peel that ivy off the wall, you probably end up with a bit of mess left behind. But the key thing here is that good knowledge management is vital for building and understanding your software. If you don't have good knowledge management, it's not going to enable you to build good software. And if you have software that maybe is a bit of a ball of mud and you're trying to migrate to something else, You need to understand that big ball of mud properly. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with a distributed big ball of mud or a wall of ivy. You need to collaborate to collect and record that knowledge. You need to get that 360-degree view, as many perspectives as possible, and break down all those silos. If we're moving towards this hive mind, we need to involve all minds, or at least as many minds as possible, because everyone knows something different to everyone else. You need to elicit the implicit knowledge, otherwise you will miss it. That's the knowledge management wrap for today. Doesn't really work with a British accent, I don't think. So you really want to be getting this information out of people's heads, because even if they don't leave your company, they are going to forget it. And even if they don't forget it, if it's in their head, you can't use it unless someone's noted it down in one of those expertise locators. But if you can get knowledge out of people's heads, more people can use it. If it's in somebody's head, it's a bottleneck at the very least. So knowledge management supports better decision making. We don't need a knowledge information system. We need a decision support system, because things change all the time. And we're trying to make decisions on a daily basis. If we understand the decisions that were made in the past and how they've panned out, but also understand the context of those decisions and understand all the systems that we've got, we can make better decisions in the future. You need to engineer your knowledge as much as you engineer software. I've said knowledge management is not a soft skill, it is data engineering. So all of you engineers need to be starting to think about how you can engineer your data and create this knowledge to get towards that wisdom and this hive mind. And what you're really aiming for here is to own your knowledge. If you don't know where that knowledge is, and you don't know what you have, you can't own it and you can't use it. Now, as with everything, your mileage may vary when applying all these different knowledge management topics. It's also going to depend on where you're starting and what sort of vehicle that you're driving. There is no miracle cure or silver bullet, sorry. But if we work together and try and apply these different techniques, then we can aim to go towards that hive mind. And I'd be really interested to hear any stories you have about any of these techniques or anything that you've tried. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me know what you think. And we can always come back to this capture, publish, and effectively use. This nice, simple mantra that when you're feeling overwhelmed with knowledge management, come back to this one. And this wisdom at the top of the wisdom hierarchy, this is your secret sauce. This is what you use to make those decisions, to make your software design and architecture decisions. And if you want to own your architecture, you need to own your knowledge. And if you don't own both of these, you're not in control. Your knowledge management and communication are the bedrock and foundation of your organization. And if those aren't solid, then you're building your organization and your software on sand. So I'd be really interested if you come and talk to me about owning your architecture and owning your knowledge. And what I'm going to be doing is putting all my slides and some further reading on my social media channels. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope it's all going to be really useful.